Continuing criticism of Chief of Staff John Sununu's high-flying ways, the White House today clipped Sununu's wings with yet another clampdown on his controversial travel practices. The story from ABC's Kathleen Delasky.
It's the third time John Sununu has had his wrist slapped by the White House, but he would not stop to defend himself today. This time he issued a statement admitting that mistakes were made. He said, "Certainly I regret that my own mistakes contributed to this controversy." The controversy heated up today when White House officials said Sununu must stop soliciting rides on corporate jets. For a recent trip to Chicago, the White House counsel, Seaboard and Gray, rejected 3 corporate sponsors that Sununu solicited because of possible conflict of interest. When Gray finally did approve a 4th sponsor, it turned out that Sununu had misinformed him about who was paying for the flight. The White House took away Sununu's power to plan his own travel. Procedures for reporting such aircraft use have been tightened to require that all information on the governor's travel will be processed by the Office of Administration.
That's a real loss of face. The Office of Administration is way down, and for a chief of staff to have something cleared at that level is truly a rebuke.
Sununu has now embarrassed the White House for his use of military jets, which he flew for ski trips and dentist appointments, his government limousine, which he took to New York for a stamp show, and now corporate jets, each time raising ethical questions. Publicly, the president is expected to stand by his man, although many other officials here are said to be angry with Sununu. And with his credibility sinking, it becomes increasingly difficult for the chief of staff to run the White House effectively. Kathleen Delasky, ABC News, the White House.
For several weeks, the vice presidential mansion has been tested for levels of lead to find out if the House were somehow responsible for the Graves' disease that both President Bush and his wife Barbara suffer. Marilyn Quayle now says initial tests of the mansion reveal high lead contamination. Here's Steve Shepard.
The vice presidential mansion in Washington may be pleasing to the eye, but not so good for one's health. Last night, Marilyn Quayle told reporters that tests show lead levels in water from some of the house's taps are unacceptably high. President and Mrs. Bush lived in the vice presidential mansion for 8 years. While they and their dog Millie suffer from diseases of the immune system, there is still no indication their problems were caused by exposure to lead.
There's absolutely no association between lead and Graves' disease.
Tests on the water at the White House and other presidential residences were ordered because the odds against both Bushes and their dogs suffering immune system disorders were so high, there was suspicion that they may have been exposed to some kind of contamination. Last month, White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater said tests indicated no contamination that might cause immune system problems. But no mention was made of high lead levels, which can cause kidney damage and other difficulties. For now, neither the Bushes nor the Quayles seem to have any problems related to lead. And Mrs. Quayle says she doesn't want to jump to any conclusions about lead until her residence is retested. Steve Shepard, ABC News, Washington.
Coming up, more evacuations in the Philippines. A hero's welcome for Secretary of State James Baker as he arrives in newly democratic Albania. And later in this broadcast, special hospital wards where clowns also make the rounds. At the isolated Balkan state. ABC's Barry Dunsmore was there.
James Baker has never had it so good. Hundreds of thousands of Albanians chanted Baker's name in an almost religious frenzy. The emotions of half a century of almost total isolation from the rest of the world were spilling out. The signs, the slogans, the U.S. flags were all part of a mass rejection of a lifetime of communist indoctrination. For his part, Baker's message was simple.
Freedom works.
In the collapse of European communism, Albania was the last domino to fall. A tiny country of just over 3 million, Albania was the most Stalinist of states. It broke with Moscow because it saw Khrushchev as too liberal. It rejected China when Beijing recognized Washington. For nearly 50 years, Albanians were locked in a 1930s time capsule under a total dictatorship. With the death of the dictator in 1985 and the end of the Cold War in 1990, Albania was forced to open its doors. This year, it has had elections and established diplomatic relations with its once most implacable enemy, the United States. The political situation here is still uncertain. Speaking to the National Assembly, which includes lots of old communists, Baker warned them not to go back to their old ways.
Just as there is no turning back on the road to a new Albania, there is no place along that road for violence, no place for intimidation, and no place for the use of force.
Baker is offering $6 million in immediate economic assistance, not really very much. But the real meaning of his visit is that for Albanians, it's the equivalent of the Berlin Wall or the Iron Curtain coming down. Tangible evidence that their long national nightmare is nearly over. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, Tirana, Albania.
In a moment, the race to build hundreds of homes for families who desperately need them.